Hey everybody, welcome back to Seascape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields, and today we're talking yeast, specifically dry or liquid yeast. What do you use, and what's the difference? Well, we're gonna get after it. Grab a beer, hit that like and subscribe button, and let's go. All right, when making a beer recipe, yeast is super important. It is a live organism that is responsible for really making your beer. It's going to be converting those sugars into alcohol during the fermentation process, and it really depends on what style of beer that you're choosing, which yeast strain that you should also choose for your recipe. So we're going to talk a little bit about the differences, but first I'd like to just touch on doing smash beers. Have any of you done that? Smash beer stands for single malt and single hop. And what that's really going to do is help you kind of identify the differences in yeast strains. If you haven't done one, I'd really suggest doing it. So you're going to really pick a standard base malt like Pilsner, two-row, Maris Otter, and then try different yeast strains. You can even break them up into smaller batches and do one boil but two smaller fermenters and try the difference. Huge difference between which yeast strain that you choose. I highly suggest doing that especially if you're new to brewing, to kind of try out a few different yeasts. That's one thing I didn't do enough when I first started brewing. A lot of people go with the Safe Ale US-05, and we'll be talking about that when we get to dry yeasts, because this is a really clean ale yeast. It comes with a lot of kits, but there's a huge variety of dry and liquid yeast that you should really branch out and try, because you'll be surprised at the difference of each beer and the flavor that changes just based on the yeast that you're using. All right, let's talk dry yeasts first. And what is a dry yeast? Well, it's dried out yeast, right? So it comes in a packet like this one or this one. This one can be stored at kind of cooler room temperatures, but most of the time you would put this in a refrigerator. It's got a longer shelf life because it's dried. And so that's really important, because most people get started on a dry yeast because it's included in a kit. And so they do that because they can put it in that kit and they can leave it for several months or even several years, and the yeast should still be good as long as it's not susceptible to really high or really cold temperatures. So let's talk a couple of brands. So first is Fermentis. I have a couple of options here that I use quite often. I think most people are familiar with Safe Ale US-05 and then the Safe Ale S-04. That's kind of the two main kind of ale yeasts. They do make lager, which is a soft lager, and then they also make a cider yeast as well. So you may be familiar with those as well. The next is Lolomond. That looks like this one here. This one usually says premium series or something like that on a lot of the tops of the beer ones. They make beer and a wine variety of their yeasts. They're readily available at most homebrew supply stores. One thing about dry yeast is that there are yeast nutrients right in this packet. So the good news is that they usually have a higher cell count. That means you don't really need to do a starter with most beers. I generally would just use one packet for if I'm doing a beer under, say, a starting gravity of 1.060 or 1060, right? So if I'm going over that, or if I'm using a packet that is getting close to, there is an expiration date, even though they last so longer, if it's getting close to that expiration date or best used by date, they call it, you can just pitch 2 packets of yeast. And you're saying, well, that might be a little bit more expensive. Yes, but that's one of the other benefits of dry yeast, is it's cheaper, right? So I can get a couple of packets of, say, US-05 versus one packet of the liquid yeast in a clean ale and spend less money generally on 2 than I will even for 1 liquid yeast. So if you do need to pitch a little bit more in your beer, you can just pitch 2 packets versus making a starter. The one con that I can find is that it's harder to find a larger variety of beer styles, especially seasonal type of styles, right? So they have a lot of clean ale yeast, a lot of lager yeast. They might have some kind of branched out varieties, but it's harder to find some of the more specific styles of beer yeasts in the drier packets. Now that's getting better, right, over the last couple of years, but some of these other strains just can't take the drying process, and so therefore liquid yeast tends to have a little bit more of a variety. So in a pinch, dry yeast is kind of a go-to for most clean ale yeasts, but it's harder to find something, say, like a hazy IPA or an Oktoberfest or some other, especially seasonal style yeasts. Another thing that people talk about when they talk about dry yeast is whether or not to rehydrate the yeast. A lot of the times on these packets, it says that you don't really have to rehydrate it. I generally don't, but if you do rehydrate, you would basically put it into 90-degree water or so. That is a dechlorinated water, usually filtered water or RO water, or even distilled water is probably best. And then you would sprinkle that into about a cup of water, let that kind of foam up and kind of rehydrate before you pitch it in. I generally don't do that. I've used dry yeast hundreds of times, and I sprinkle that stuff right on the top of my wort. I generally will sprinkle it in a little bit before it hits fermentation temperature too. So as I'm cooling it down, especially in the summertime, if my wort chiller can't get it all the way down to fermentation temperature, I throw it in my fermentation chamber, and then as it gets down into the kind of mid to lower 70s, I pitch that thing, even though my fermentation temperature may be mid to upper 60s, right? So it kind of gets it warmed up. I let that kind of sit on the top for 5, 10, 15 minutes, come back, give it a good shake around, and then let it do its thing. But again, one packet, especially if it's not close to its best by date, should be able to handle most beers that are 1.060 or 1060 or less without having to pitch 2 of them. So let's move on to liquid yeast. And I don't really have any on hand because liquid yeast isn't quite shelf stable. So I do keep some dry packets around because they last longer. So that's one of the cons of liquid yeast. And so I buy a liquid yeast. Generally, I'm gonna need to make a starter, or I have to determine what kind of style it is, but usually I make a starter. There are 3 different kind of yeast brands that are readily available in the United States anyway, and that's Yeast. They're known for having that packet inside. It's called a smack pack. That packet has yeast nutrients right inside of the packet. Then you break that open, it kind of lets it do its thing for a few minutes, you shake it up while you're doing your brew day, and then it's ready to pitch when you're done. White Labs is another one. They're probably known for having probably the most variety right now. There's a lot of different companies that are coming out right now, and some of the companies that have been established are creating more and more varieties, but White Labs has a ton of varieties. One of the things that I think as a con though is that they have probably one of the lower cell counts. So most of the time I've even had to either having to pitch more than 1 vial in a pinch or making a yeast starter well in advance. And so for most of my White Labs yeast, I will make a yeast starter, usually a 1 liter starter, no matter what the starting gravity is. 2 other brands, Omega and Imperial. So Omega and Imperial both have higher cell counts than White Labs generally, not all the time, but generally. And usually they can have a higher gravity beer with 1 packet without having to make a yeast starter. So I recently did, for instance, a Oktoberfest. That Oktoberfest pack said anything under 1070, you're good to go. I also used an Omega yeast for a hazy IPA I did recently. That one as well. I actually used a starter for that one, and the starter just took off. I mean, it really, really went fast. And then when I poured that starter into my hazy after it was done with the brew day, within like 24 to 36 hours, that thing had just blown up. It went so fast. I was able to add dry hops during high Krausen on day 2, I think. It was amazing. And that hazy turned out really, really good. And these liquid yeasts are going to be where you're going to find those specialty varieties, those seasonal varieties, a lot more varieties when it comes to, New England IPAs, Oktoberfest. Dry yeasts are going to be more about shelf life and the specific kind of standard ale, lager, cider type of yeast, wine, etc. Depending on what style of beer you're doing is really why I choose a yeast. At the end of the day, if I'm doing a standard ale yeast, I could choose a liquid yeast or I could choose a dry yeast like US-05, right? For most of my sours, I just pitch a US-05 because sours have a lot more going on with the choices of malt, the souring process, the fruit additions and the secondary, all those flavors. The yeast is less important. But when you go for an Oktoberfest or a hazy or something else, those type of yeasts are very important because they're gonna make or break your recipe depending on whether you get those perceived flavors in your eventual beer. So try out different yeasts. If you have questions, leave them in the video description below. Happy to help out. As always, hit that like and subscribe button. Happy brewing and cheers. Thanks for watching my video. I really do appreciate it. Another couple ways that you can help support the channel is by hitting that like and subscribe button. You can also check out the merchandise in our store. I have other shirts, we got glassware, we got stickers, hats, sweatshirts, etc. Go check it out. Also, hit that video here, you know you want to.